It was supposed to be a normal Tuesday morning, quiet, simple, peaceful. I was at the kitchen table with my bills spread out, trying to balance what little I had left from my pension. My son walked in, took one look, and burst out laughing. He called me a burden, said I couldn't even pay my own bills. His wife laughed too, holding her coffee like she was watching a show. I didn't answer. I just folded the papers and smiled. They thought they were mocking weakness. But the house they stood in, every brick, every wall, was mine. The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds, warm and soft, touching the edges of the old table I'd sat at for decades. On it lay a few bills: electricity, water, phone. Small papers that somehow carried the weight of my entire life. I had just marked one envelope with a note to pay later when my son walked in. He didn't knock anymore. He hadn't in years. He glanced at the table, saw the envelopes, and smirked. There was a kind of cruel amusement in his eyes, the kind that only grows when someone believes they'll never be challenged. He picked up the electricity bill, waved it in the air, and laughed like he'd found a joke. "You can't even pay your own bills, Mom," he said, loud enough for his wife to hear from the hallway. She joined in with a small laugh, sipping her coffee as if it were entertainment. I sat there, hands folded, watching them both. My house had never felt smaller than it did at that moment. I wanted to remind him that I had built this home with 2 jobs, that I'd cooked, cleaned, and fought to keep the lights on when he was little. But the words never came. I had said them too many times before, and he had stopped hearing them long ago. He leaned against the counter, still grinning. "Don't worry," he added. "If you can't manage, we'll take care of things. Maybe it's time you stopped pretending to be independent." His wife laughed again, that short, sharp sound that used to sting less when I thought she didn't mean it. But that day, it was clear. She did. I looked around the kitchen, the faded wallpaper, the chipped mug on the counter, the family photos hanging near the fridge. They were all remnants of a time when love still lived in this house. But now, the air was heavy with disrespect. It wasn't the first insult. Over the years, their tone had shifted. Once, he used to say "Mum" with warmth. Now it was like a burden on his tongue. Every conversation ended with a sigh, every visit with criticism. He had built a small company, earned money, and decided that made him taller than me, even as he stood under the roof I bought. As he laughed, I stared at his face. The same face I'd once wiped tears from. The same mouth that had called me his hero when he was small. Now, that same mouth-shaped cruelty, like it was nothing. When the laughter finally stopped, I picked up the bill he'd mocked. I folded it slowly, set it aside, and met his eyes for the first time. He didn't notice the calm in my expression. He mistook it for defeat. That was his mistake. Inside, something had shifted. I wasn't angry. I was awake. After they left, I sat for hours, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. My hands trembled, not from sadness, but from the spark of memory. I remembered the day I signed the mortgage papers, how proud I had been, how certain that I was building a foundation for him, not just a house, but a future. I had forgotten that my name was the one on those papers, not his. As the sun sank, I poured myself a cup of tea and looked at the framed photo of my late husband on the shelf. He had warned me, years ago, to never give away control out of love. I had smiled then, thinking our son would never betray that love. But now, the truth sat in front of me in a pile of unpaid bills and one cruel laugh. I realized I didn't need to raise my voice or seek revenge. The papers already held my power. Signed, sealed, legal. The next morning, I would open the drawer where those documents were kept, the ones he never bothered to read, and remind myself of something simple. He wasn't mocking my poverty. He was standing on my property. And so, I folded the last bill, placed it neatly on the counter, and whispered to myself the truth that he would learn soon enough. Sometimes the people who laugh the loudest forget who built the walls around them. The smell of cement and wet paint still lives somewhere deep in my memory, the scent of the home I built from nothing. 25 years ago, this house wasn't just a structure. It was survival turned into something solid. I can still picture the first day I walked through the empty rooms, floorboards echoing beneath my tired feet, sunlight cutting through the dust. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Every wall carried the sound of my struggle and the promise that my son would never know the hunger or fear I had. Back then, money was never steady. I worked 3 jobs: cashier by day, cleaner by night, and seamstress when everyone slept. My hands were always raw, but I never complained. Every coin, every crumpled note went into a small tin box beneath my bed. My dream fund. And when it was full enough, I went to the bank and signed the papers that would change everything. I remember the man who handled the mortgage, kind and soft-spoken. He smiled as he watched me sign my name. "You're doing something good for your family," he said. I smiled back, proud and nervous. I never imagined that the same signature would one day become my greatest weapon. When my son was still small, I'd tell him stories while fixing his school uniform. I'd say, "This house is our proof, my boy. Proof that hard work builds safety." He used to nod, eyes wide, and promise to take care of it when I was old. I held on to those promises for decades, even when they started to fade behind his ambition. Years later, when his father died, the house became more than shelter. It became my sanctuary, the last piece of life we had built together. I never remarried. I poured my love into that home and into raising our son. Every decision revolved around him, his comfort, his education, his future. I wanted him to walk on floors I had cleaned, to sleep under a roof I had fought for. When he turned 21, I made a choice that I thought was love. I added his name to the property papers. I didn't do it for security. I did it for legacy. I thought, if anything happens to me, at least he'll never be homeless. I remember the day clearly, the sound of my pen scratching the paper, my heart swelling with pride. I believed I was giving him the greatest gift a mother could offer: stability. But what I didn't realize then was that I was giving away the one thing that gave me power, and that love, without boundaries, can become a noose when handed to the ungrateful. Over time, the boy who once promised to protect the home began to act like its master. He started calling it his house, forgetting who had built it. The walls that once echoed with his laughter began to hear something else: orders, mockery, arrogance. I'd watch him walk around the living room, phone in hand, boasting to friends about how he took care of his mother. He liked that image, the dutiful son. But the truth was simpler. I still paid the bills, cooked the meals, and cleaned the house while he reaped the glory of being generous. I was the ghost, keeping everything together. Even then, I didn't resent him. I reminded myself that generations change. Maybe his laughter was just youth, not cruelty. Maybe his pride was just success, not disrespect. But over the years, every maybe turned into a no. He started helping me manage my accounts. said it was easier that way since I was retired. I let him because I trusted him. He set up automatic transfers and handled the paperwork. Slowly, I became invisible in my own financial life, and I didn't even notice when my independence slipped through my fingers. Until the morning he laughed. That single moment shattered years of denial. I realized then that the man standing in front of me was not the boy I raised. He wasn't the son who helped me paint the nursery or planted tulips by the porch. He was someone else, someone who had mistaken my silence for weakness. I looked at the wall where an old photo still hung, the one of me holding him as a baby in front of the unfinished house. The smile on my face was tired but proud. That was the woman who had built everything, the woman he'd just mocked. He didn't know it yet, but the power he thought was his still belonged to her. It was written, signed and sealed long before he was old enough to understand what a mortgage even meant. The house had my name first, and it would have my name last. It started slowly, not like a storm, but like a steady leak. One day, he asked if he could handle my mail since I forgot things sometimes. Another day, he said I didn't need to go to the bank anymore because he could set up online payments. I told myself it was kindness. I told myself this was what good sons did for aging mothers. I didn't notice that I was quietly being erased from my own life, one small signature at a time. After retirement, I lived modestly. My pension wasn't much, but it covered what I needed. Electricity, groceries, a few medicines. I'd always been careful. For decades, I balanced every account to the penny. I had pride in that. But when the payments started coming late, I didn't panic. I thought it was just delays or some small mistake in the system. My son insisted he would take over to make things easier. Easier meant invisible. Within months, he was opening my letters before I could. He'd file them away in drawers I no longer had keys for. Whenever I asked, he'd wave his hand and say, "Don't worry, Mom, I've got it." It sounded comforting then. But comfort can be a quiet cage if you're not careful. Then came the jokes. Small ones at first. "Mom, you don't understand technology anymore." "Mom, you're lucky I'm around, or you'd forget your own name." Each laugh chipped away at me, but I smiled anyway. That's what mothers do. They smile through disrespect and call it love. He started paying bills from his account, or so he said. I didn't know what he was paying, how much, or when. I stopped receiving statements because they were redirected to his email. I wasn't even sure what was still in my name. Every time I asked, he grew impatient. "Why don't you just relax?" he'd say. "You've done enough. Let me handle it." But it wasn't help. It was control. The house began to change too. Small things at first. New furniture I hadn't agreed to. Gadgets I didn't understand. Locks replaced without asking me. He said it was for security, but I knew it wasn't to keep danger out. It was to keep ownership in his hands. My home, the one I built with scraped wages and sleepless nights, started to feel like someone else's property. And yet, I still believed he loved me. Even when I had to ask permission to use my own card, even when he borrowed money and forgot to return it, even when he started referring to my house as our house, I told myself it was pride, that maybe men needed to feel powerful, that maybe this was his way of showing he cared, by taking charge. But the truth? He wasn't taking charge, he was taking over. The humiliation came quietly, woven into everyday life. He'd talk to neighbors about how tough it was to look after me. He'd sigh loudly when I asked for help carrying groceries. He'd remind me how generous he was for letting me stay here rent-free. Rent-free. in the home my blood and bones had built. I laughed politely every time he said it, though inside, something burned. One afternoon, I went to make tea, and he stopped me. "Don't waste electricity during the day, Mom," he said. "You don't need to use the kettle so often." That was the first time I felt the weight of ownership shift entirely. The boy who once asked me for lunch money was now counting my electricity usage. His wife joined in the pattern. She began referring to my belongings as old stuff, rearranging things in my kitchen as if I were already gone. They made plans in front of me about renovations. "When we redo our house," they'd say, while I sat quietly, holding my cup of cold tea. Still, I waited for a sign of warmth. A thank you, a gentle word, anything. It never came. One day, I overheard him on the phone telling a friend, "She doesn't even know how much I've done for her. She's useless with money." That night, I cried. Not because of the insult, but because I realized something final. My own child saw me as a burden, not as the woman who had built the life he was living. That was when I stopped waiting for gratitude. I decided I would reclaim what was mine, quietly, legally, completely. I didn't yet know how, but I knew the first step. I needed to find the papers I once signed with pride. The next morning, I opened my old wooden drawer and ran my fingers over the edge of a worn file, yellowed, but intact. Inside it was the story of every sacrifice, every payment, every ounce of proof I would ever need. My name was written there in ink that hadn't faded. It was the same name he'd soon learned never really disappeared. It happened on a Sunday, the kind of slow afternoon when the world feels still. The table was set neatly with teacups, buttered toast, and a small plate of biscuits. My son had invited a few neighbors and friends over, claiming it was to lighten things up. I believed him, foolishly perhaps, thinking maybe laughter could heal what pride had broken. When everyone arrived, I smiled politely, poured tea, and listened to stories I didn't recognize anymore. The neighbors laughed at his jokes. His wife played hostess, showing off new curtains and expensive dishes. I sat quietly at the edge of the table, where I always sat. The mother who built it all, but was now treated like a guest. Then, as the kettle whistled softly in the background, it happened. My son leaned back in his chair, swirling his cup, and said to one of the guests, "You know, Mom can't even pay her own bills anymore. I have to handle everything." Laughter rippled around the table. His friends smiled awkwardly, unsure if it was humor or humiliation. His wife giggled, that sharp metallic sound I'd grown used to. I froze. My spoon clinked against the cup, echoing louder than I meant it to. I looked at my son, my boy who once cried over scraped knees and whispered that I was his hero. Now he was laughing at my weakness in a room full of strangers. No one defended me. Not one. I smiled, a small, trembling smile that hurt my face, and said nothing. I sipped my tea as the heat burned my throat. I wanted to cry, but pride kept my eyes dry. I realized in that moment that tears would only feed their laughter. Silence, I decided, would starve it. After everyone left, I cleaned the table slowly, wiping each stain as though erasing memories. He didn't apologize. He didn't even notice. He went to bed humming to himself while I stood by the window, staring into the quiet street, wondering where I had gone wrong. But as the moonlight touched the glass, something inside me shifted. That humiliation, that moment of being mocked in my own home, burned away the last bit of blind love I had left. I had sacrificed my youth, my dreams, my health for him. But that night, I decided I would no longer sacrifice my dignity. When the dishes were washed and the house silent, I walked to my room and opened the old drawer by my bedside. Inside was a brown folder filled with papers, property documents, mortgage agreements, and loan contracts. My husband and I had filed them carefully over the years, never imagining they'd one day become my defense. I opened the top page and traced my name, my full name, written in dark, unshaken ink. Under it, in smaller print, was my son's. His name appeared only as guarantor, not owner. The property, the mortgage, the legal rights, all of it still belonged to me. My fingers trembled, not from weakness, but from awakening. All this time, he had thought he was protecting me. He had told his friends he was managing my finances. He had even acted like the house was his, like I was a dependent living under his care. But that night, the papers told a different story, one that started long before his arrogance was born. I stayed up till dawn reading every clause, every signature. I didn't need revenge. I needed justice. Quiet, undeniable justice. By the time the sun rose, I had made my decision. I folded the papers neatly, placed them back in the folder, and set it on the kitchen counter. My plan wasn't born from anger. It was born from clarity. I realized that power doesn't shout. It simply signs. When he came down for breakfast later that morning, cheerful and proud from last night's performance, I watched him pour his coffee and brag about how responsible he was. I just smiled. He had no idea the stage had changed, that the next act wouldn't have an audience, only consequences. I cleaned the table again after he left, but this time I wasn't wiping away shame. I was preparing space for peace, space for freedom, space for my next move, because the day before, he had mocked my bills, and the next day, he would realize whose name was on the mortgage. Morning light slipped through the curtains, pale and calm, the kind of light that makes everything look harmless. But that day, it revealed something far from gentle. The folder I'd left on the counter was still there, right where I'd placed it. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for it again, not out of fear, but from a strange sense of rebirth. I was about to look at my life on paper, line by line, clause by clause. The first thing I saw was my name, Margaret Lewis, stamped, sealed, and written in ink so bold it could never be erased. Beneath it, in smaller, almost apologetic letters, was his name. Paul Lewis, Jr., not as owner, not as equal, just as guarantor. It hit me all at once. For all his arrogance, for all his laughter about my bills, he had never actually read the documents that gave him shelter. I remembered the day we signed them. He was still young then, eager to buy his first car, to show off to friends. He hadn't even glanced at the paperwork. "Just tell me where to sign, Mum," he'd said, back then with love, not mockery. And I'd smiled, thinking it was endearing. But that small act of trust, that signature, had frozen time. It had preserved my ownership long after he'd forgotten who paid the first bricklayer, who argued with the bank manager, who mopped paint from the floors after the final coat. It was all still mine, hidden in plain sight. I flipped through every page. The renewal clause was still valid. The house was legally mine until death or voluntary transfer. And since I had never signed anything after that day, nothing had changed. I was the sole owner of the property. The mortgage was in my name, and every single bill, water, gas, electricity, was technically my responsibility. but that also meant the power was mine to decide who stayed under that roof. For years, I had handed over my independence to him in exchange for peace. I thought letting him manage things would keep us close, that it would give him pride, that it would make him feel useful. But instead, it had given him a throne he didn't earn. Now the paper in my hands took that throne away. I spent hours reviewing old files, tracing the history of my home. There were receipts from the builders, photographs of me painting the living room with my late husband, and even an old letter from the bank congratulating me on paying off the loan. My name was on everything. Proof that I had not been living under my son's generosity, but that he had been living under mine. A strange calm settled over me. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was noisy, and this kind of justice deserved silence. I realized that life had already written my revenge long before I needed it. I just had to read it carefully. By noon, I'd made my decision. I would not shout, I would not beg, and I would not remind him of kindness. I would let the ink do the talking. That afternoon, I walked to my desk and pulled out my old address book. I hadn't used it in years, but I found the number easily. The bank manager, a kind man I'd known since I first took the mortgage. My hands didn't shake when I dialed. I told him I wanted to verify ownership details. He checked the records while I waited on hold. When he came back, his tone was respectful. "Mrs. Lewis, everything is exactly as you left it. You are the sole borrower and title holder." The confirmation wasn't just relief, it was liberation. I thanked him, hung up, and sat in silence for a long time. It was a strange feeling, to realize that all along I hadn't lost control. I had just forgotten where I'd placed it. When evening came, my son returned home, cheerful, humming again, unaware that the ground beneath his arrogance had already shifted. I served him dinner as usual, the same quiet rhythm of our strained routine. He talked about his day, about bills, about how lucky I was to have him. I smiled faintly, nodding at all the right times. He didn't notice the folder resting beside the fruit bowl. He didn't notice the way I looked at the walls. Not as a prisoner anymore, but as an owner. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in years. Because I knew that the next morning, the power he laughed about would no longer be his illusion. It would be my truth, written, sealed, and ready to remind him who really paid for the roof over his head. The next morning began like any other. Soft sunlight, the quiet hum of the kettle, and the faint sound of birds outside. But something had changed in the air. I wasn't the same woman who had sat through mockery and silence. I had spent years shrinking myself to keep peace, but now I felt something steadier inside me. Purpose. I sat at the kitchen table with the folder open again. Each page looked stronger than it did the night before. Ownership, mortgage clauses, renewal terms. All of it was mine. I had lived half my life believing I had nothing left to control, and yet there it was. Control printed neatly, line after line, waiting to be used. The phone sat beside the papers. I knew what I needed to do. No shouting, no tears. Just one calm call. I dialed the number I'd written on a scrap of paper the day before, the bank manager's direct line. He answered with the same voice I remembered from years ago, polite and measured. When I told him my name, he paused, then brightened. "Mrs. Lewis, it's been a long time. What can I do for you?" I explained that I wanted to review my property records and check the linked accounts. He confirmed everything, the mortgage, the ownership, the title. It was all under my control. Then he asked gently if I wanted to make any adjustments. Yes, I said quietly. I want to restrict access to any secondary accounts and authorizations not signed directly by me. He didn't ask why. Maybe he didn't need to. Maybe he could hear the exhaustion in my voice. Within minutes, he confirmed that new restrictions would be placed. No joint activity. No third-party permissions. My son's name, the one he wore like a crown, would no longer hold authority. When I hung up, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. A deep, steady calm that only truth can bring. Then I made a second call. This time to a solicitor I'd once worked with through community projects. He was kind and efficient, and when I explained my situation, he didn't sound surprised. He'd heard stories like mine before. Parents handing over power too early. Children confusing love for ownership. He asked for copies of the documents, and I faxed them through from the small office at the corner shop. Within an hour, he confirmed everything. Mrs. Lewis, he said, your position is solid. If you wish, I can prepare a statement to assert exclusive ownership and remove any potential claims. I agreed. Not to humiliate my son, but to make sure no one could humiliate me again. By afternoon, the paperwork was set in motion. My solicitor would file the documents with the land registry to reaffirm sole ownership. He would also notify the bank that all associated accounts and loans linked under my name should be isolated until further verification. I didn't tell my son. I didn't tell anyone. I made tea, watered my plants, and carried on as though nothing had changed. But everything had. That evening, when my son came home, he was cheerful again. He'd forgotten the sting of his words. He asked if I'd paid the bills. I told him not to worry. I had taken care of everything. He grinned, satisfied, thinking I meant I'd handed it all back to him. But what I really meant was that I had taken it away. Later that night, I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker. I thought about the irony. How he had once mocked my slowness, my outdated ways, my old-fashioned thinking. But it was those same habits. Saving every receipt, keeping every file, reading every word, that now gave me quiet power. Justice doesn't always need noise. Sometimes it just needs a phone call made at the right hour. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, I could almost feel the shift begin. In the systems, in the records, in the digital space where numbers defined ownership. My son's arrogance had always been loud, but what was coming next would arrive in silence. Notifications, letters, balances freezing one by one. I didn't smile. Not yet. Revenge isn't in the result. It's in the control you take back after being told you had none. When I finally went to bed, I slept deeply. For the first time in years, I didn't dream of loss or regret. I dreamt of clarity, papers stamped, calls completed, dignity restored. He had laughed about my bills. Tomorrow, he would wake up to his own. The morning arrived like any other, but for him, it would not end the same. I woke early, made tea, and sat by the window, listening to the quiet hum of the street. The kettle hissed gently, calm before the storm. My phone buzzed once, twice, 3 times. Notifications from the bank, each one confirming that the changes I had made the day before were active. The accounts were frozen for review. Access permissions were restricted. Only the primary name, mine, remained authorized. I sipped my tea slowly. The world outside moved on as though nothing had changed, but inside this small house, power had shifted silently overnight. My son was about to discover it. It began with his voice echoing from the hall. Sharp, frustrated, calling my name louder than usual. I didn't answer immediately. He stormed into the kitchen, his phone clutched in his hand, eyes blazing. "There's something wrong with the account," he said, more accusation than question. "My payments aren't going through." I looked up from my tea, steady and calm. "Oh?" I said, as though I hadn't known for hours. He waved the phone in front of me. "It says restricted access. What does that even mean?" For a moment I just watched him. The same boy I once carried to school on rainy mornings now looked like a man who'd built his arrogance on the false belief that he owned everything around him. He didn't understand yet that the foundation beneath his confidence had always been mine. I rose slowly, walked to the counter, and picked up the folder, the same one that had slept quietly for years. I placed it on the table between us. He frowned, confused. "Read it," I said softly. He flipped through the pages, his breathing uneven. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Then his eyes stopped. The line that mattered most. Primary borrower. Margaret Lewis. He blinked, then read it again, and again. I watched his expression shift. Disbelief first, then panic. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, but no words came. "This can't be right," he muttered. "This house. You gave it to me." I shook my head gently. "No, I let you live here. There's a difference." Silence filled the kitchen. He stared at the papers, at his own name, written smaller beneath mine. The arrogance that once filled the air was gone. It had evaporated in the space between ink and truth. I took another sip of tea. "The bank called this morning," I said evenly. "They've corrected the access. You'll get a letter soon." He slammed the folder shut. "You're trying to ruin me." "No," I replied quietly. "You did that when you forgot who paid for this roof." His face flushed, anger and shame twisting together. He opened his mouth to argue, but there was nothing left to stand on. He turned away, pacing, his voice breaking between disbelief and regret. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he said. "Yes," I said. I remembered what I'd already done, a long time ago. There was no shouting match, no dramatic ending, just the sound of footsteps softening as the weight of his pride fell away. An hour later, when he left the house, I sat back down at the table. The folder still lay open, the page still showing my name. The papers didn't just prove ownership. They proved memory. They reminded me that I had built this life, brick by brick, bill by bill, while he had merely inherited its comfort. That afternoon, the mail arrived, a white envelope from the bank, confirming the changes in control. I placed it beside his empty coffee cup. I didn't need to send it to him. He would know soon enough. When evening came, the house was quiet. Too quiet. His car didn't return. For the first time in years, I felt peace in that silence. No more mockery, no more condescension. Just me, the house, and the walls I'd once built with love. Now mine again, both legally and emotionally. I looked around at the pictures on the walls. His childhood smile, the first day of school, birthdays, graduations. Memories framed in the innocence that once was. I felt no hatred, only a deep, bitter-sweet clarity. He had learned his lesson not through punishment, but through truth. And as I switched off the lights that night, I whispered to myself. He laughed that I couldn't pay my bills, but now he knows I paid for everything. The next day, the world outside carried on as usual. But inside this house, balance had returned. Justice had no need for witnesses or applause. It just needed proof. and a quiet hand strong enough to turn the tables. It didn't take long for reality to arrive. The morning after our quiet confrontation, I heard him on the phone in the next room. His voice, once confident, was cracked with panic. Words like blocked, restricted, and legal notice floated through the air like broken promises. He had spent years laughing at my simplicity, calling me old-fashioned. But now, the same modern world he'd bragged about was closing its digital doors on him. By noon, he came into the kitchen, the arrogance drained from his face. He didn't speak. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes red, and the proud smirk that once defined him was gone. For the first time in a long while, he looked like a boy again, lost and ashamed. I didn't gloat. I simply poured tea into a cup and placed it on the table. He stood there silently, staring at the folder still lying open from yesterday. The mortgage papers, the title, the legal confirmations, all neatly arranged. His gaze lingered on my name, as though seeing it for the first time. I could almost hear the truth settling inside him, that the roof above his head had always belonged to me. He tried to speak. The words stumbled out, apologies tangled with excuses. "Mom, I didn't mean..." But I raised my hand slightly, not in anger, but in quiet authority. I didn't need to hear his justifications. Words are easy. Responsibility is not. I told him calmly that he would need to find another place to stay, at least until he could learn to respect the hands that built the walls he once claimed. His eyes widened in disbelief. "You're kicking me out?" I nodded. "You left me long before this moment. I'm just giving shape to what you already did." He didn't argue. Maybe he knew there was no winning this time. Maybe, deep down, he understood this wasn't punishment. It was correction. That afternoon, he packed his bags. His wife didn't bother to help him. She had left earlier, angry that her comforts were slipping away. Pride doesn't survive paperwork. He moved slowly, taking longer than needed, as if delay could change my decision. I watched from the hallway, quiet and steady. When he paused at the door, he looked back, his expression softening for the first time in years. There was something unspoken there. Regret, maybe even love, buried beneath layers of ego. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I didn't fill the silence. I let him feel it. After he left, the house exhaled. The air felt lighter. The rooms, once filled with tension, now carried only the soft hum of peace. For the first time in years, I walked through every room and felt ownership in my bones. Not because of money, but because of dignity. That evening, I gathered his leftover things. His old photographs, a jacket he never wore, a few unpaid bills, and placed them neatly in a box. On top, I left a note. "When you remember who you were, you'll remember who I am." Days passed quietly. The neighbors noticed his absence. One asked if everything was all right, and I smiled, saying only, "It's quieter now." I didn't explain further. Some lessons don't need narration. They unfold in whispers, not announcements. Weeks later, I received a letter from him. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. It wasn't full of excuses or demands, just a short paragraph. He said he understood now, that he'd been proud, blind, and cruel, that he was working again, saving, trying to earn back not the house, but my respect. I folded the letter and tucked it into the folder beside the mortgage papers. Not as a keepsake of sorrow, but as proof that even broken pride can learn humility. The house felt warm again. I began tending to the garden, trimming roses, planting new seeds. Every morning, I'd water them and think of how growth often follows loss. He had mocked my weakness, and I had shown him quiet strength, not through shouting, not through anger, but through action, through ink. And as I stood at the window that night, watching the lights flicker across the empty driveway, I felt no bitterness, only balance. The arrogance that once echoed through these walls was gone, replaced by the soft hum of justice restored. He learned that day that a mother's silence isn't submission, it's a warning. And when she finally speaks, she doesn't raise her voice. She raises consequences. The days that followed felt like a different season. The air in the house changed, softer, lighter, free from the heavy footsteps of arrogance and noise. For the first time in years, I woke up without the sound of someone demanding or complaining. The quiet didn't feel empty, it felt earned. I began each morning with purpose. I reorganized every drawer, every file, every detail of my life that I had once handed over in the name of love. I called the utility companies and placed everything back in my own name. One by one, I untangled myself from the mess of shared accounts and responsibilities that had trapped me in dependency. The woman he mocked for being helpless now managed everything herself. Every number, every bill, every choice. I set up direct debits for my electricity, water, and pension deposits. The bank clerk who helped me smiled when I told her I'd rather do it myself than let anyone else handle it. She didn't know the full story, but she could see it in my eyes. I wasn't rebuilding finances. I was rebuilding dignity. In the afternoons, I began walking again. Not hurried steps to the post office or the grocery store, but slow, deliberate strolls through the park. I watched families, mothers with children, old couples holding hands. Sometimes, I thought of my son and wondered if he was doing all right. But I didn't let the thought linger long. I had spent too many years thinking of everyone else's comfort. It was time I thought of my own. The garden became my companion. I pulled weeds, planted new flowers, and restored the small vegetable patch that had once fed us both. My hands, once trembling from stress, now found peace in the soil. There's something honest about growing things. They respond only to care, not to pride. Neighbors began stopping by again. They had noticed the difference. The fresh paint on the fence, the tidy path, the quiet but confident energy returning to the house. One neighbor said, "It's good to see you smiling again." I simply nodded. I didn't explain. True peace doesn't need explanation. Letters from my son started arriving, short, polite, uncertain. He apologized again, said he was trying to rebuild, that he hoped I was well. I replied only once. A brief note saying I was fine and that I hoped he found his way. After that, I chose silence. Not from anger, but from understanding that some relationships survive better in absence than in proximity. Inside, I turned the guest room, once his room, into something new. A reading space. I brought in a small bookshelf, filled it with the novels I'd bought over the years and never had time to read. I placed a soft chair by the window and a lamp that glowed warm in the evenings. Every time I sat there with a cup of tea, I realized how good it felt to live on my own terms again. Bills arrived, and I paid them without worry. Not because I was rich, but because I was free. The same envelope that once brought shame now brought pride. Proof that I was capable. He had laughed that I couldn't handle money. Now I smiled each time I saw my name printed clearly on every statement. Margaret Lewis, owner, not dependent. Weeks passed into months. I started volunteering at the local library, helping older women set up online accounts and teaching them how to read documents carefully before signing anything. Some of them reminded me of myself, tired, trusting, and afraid of paperwork. I'd tell them gently, "Never hand over what you built. Keep your name on what matters." They listened. I could see understanding flicker in their eyes. The house that once felt like a battlefield now felt like a sanctuary. Every corner told a story, not of betrayal, but of recovery. I stopped thinking about revenge long ago. Revenge is loud and temporary. Restoration is quiet and lasting. Every night, as I turned off the lights and walked down the hallway, I passed by the folder on the shelf, the same one that changed everything. I never hid it. It stayed visible, a reminder of what one signature, one act of courage, can do. He had taken my trust and turned it into weakness. I took his arrogance and turned it into peace. And when I looked in the mirror now, I didn't see a fragile old woman struggling to keep up. I saw someone who had been underestimated and who had finally remembered her worth. Justice hadn't come with noise. It had come with stillness. And I had learned that sometimes silence isn't empty. It's power, perfectly contained. The sun had started setting behind the hills, painting the sky in soft gold and quiet pink. I sat by the window, the same spot where I had once watched my son return home with laughter and arrogance. Now, the chair beside me stayed empty, but I didn't mind. Peace doesn't always come with company. Sometimes it comes with distance. I held a cup of tea in one hand and the last envelope in the other. It was from him again, another letter. His handwriting had steadied this time. He wrote that he'd found a small apartment, a steady job, and a slower kind of life. He said he thought of me often. He didn't ask for money or forgiveness, only said, "I hope you're proud of me." I folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the others. Pride, I realized, wasn't about success. It was about lessons learned, even the hard ones. That evening, I walked through the house, touching the walls as if greeting old friends. The same rooms that had once echoed with shame now hummed with strength. I'd earned that strength not through wealth or revenge, but through remembering who I was before anyone tried to define me. I stood in front of the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't frail or defeated. Her hair had silvered, her hands had wrinkled, but her eyes held something fierce and steady. They no longer searched for validation. They no longer begged for respect. They simply knew. I sat down again and opened the folder one last time. The mortgage papers. The title deed. My name, printed clearly, unshaken. It wasn't just about ownership. It was about identity. For years, I had been told I was old, dependent, past my prime. But the truth was simple. I was the foundation, the beginning, the reason he had something to call his own. And yet, it wasn't just about proving him wrong. It was about proving to myself that I still had control, not only of the house, but of my story. I closed the folder and smiled. The paper didn't just represent justice. It represented boundaries, the kind that protect love from turning into entitlement. I didn't hate my son. I had simply stopped allowing him to confuse my silence for weakness. I often think of other women like me, mothers who've given everything and been left with nothing but empty chairs and unpaid gratitude. I want to tell them that peace doesn't live in forgiveness alone. Sometimes peace lives in accountability. We spend our lives teaching our children right from wrong, but sometimes they need to be taught what consequences feel like, not through anger, but through clarity, not through shouting, but through signatures. I looked outside. The streetlights flickered on one by one. Somewhere, far away, my son was learning what it means to earn his comfort, to pay his own bills, to build a home on his own. I didn't need to see it to believe it. The house was mine, but so was the stillness. The kind that hums when justice finally finds balance. I'd spent decades giving love without measure. This was the first time I'd kept some for myself. I took one last sip of tea and spoke quietly, not to the room, but to the women who might be listening. Women like me who had forgotten how strong they once were. He laughed that I couldn't pay my bills, I said softly. But the next day, he remembered whose name was on the mortgage. Then, turning slightly toward the window, I let the words linger, a lesson wrapped in calm. I didn't ruin him. I reminded him. I didn't shout for respect. I signed for it. Tell me, if your own child mocked your struggle, would you cry and beg for understanding, or would you let the papers speak louder than your pain? And as the night settled, the house felt full again. Not of people, but of dignity, the kind that doesn't need applause because it already knows its worth.